Right. So, welcome to the Times, the newsletter of Botanical University Challenge. Dr. Marjorie Lundgren, UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and Senior Research Fellow in Environmental Physiology at the University of Lancaster. Now, you've had a really interesting career so far, and I'm sure it's going to go and be very interesting into the future. But you work with plants, of course. And I guess the first question is, how did you get into plants?
That's a very good question. And without sounding corny, it just kind of, I never questioned it. So I grew up in a farm in rural New England in America. And it was the same house my father grew up in and my grandfather grew up in. And I just, I was the youngest of seven kids. We had a big family, nine of us in total, and I would just spend my days wandering around outside with my sisters. And I remember just wandering around meadows in the woodland, and um, I was always fascinated by plants. So I don't think it was an active choice. It just kind of was always there in the background and always something I found fascinating.
Okay, so I mean, so you then went on to study at university,
Yes.
and you started off doing field-based studies
Mhm,
related to plants, and you've now moved into lab-based studies.
mhm.
So, what sort of journey took you from the field to the lab?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the earliest research I did in plants was probably first I worked with a nature conservancy in America, and I did this really cool study looking at invasive plants. It was a field study and trying to look at past land use and how that influences current invasive plant abundance. And it's funny because in New England, in America, a lot of it's forested now, but it wasn't always. So basically, it used to be forest, and then for a long time, it was clear cut for agriculture a couple hundred years ago, and then it went back to forest. And so that was a really cool study. And what we found is that land that used to be agriculture, even regardless of its current state, even if currently it's a forest, if it used to be agriculture, it was just covered with invasives now. So that was my first kind of introduction to plant studies. And then I did some work with the school I was at then, Connecticut College. Of course, colleges in America are university level. So when I was an undergraduate, I was doing studies in um, woodland, temperate woodlands. So I did more invasive work there and kind of deer browse kind of work. So that was all outdoors, outdoors, outdoors. I did get a pretty terrible spell of Lyme disease on that
Oh,
field work, which is well, maybe one of the first reasons I started rethinking being in the field. Um, yeah, and Lyme disease, as you probably know, can be quite rough. So that was when I was probably about 21, 22. And then I went straight into a PhD program after I finished undergrad. So straight into a PhD in America. And that was on phenotypic plasticity in plants. So, um, you know, when you grow plants with the exact same genetic background, how do they grow differently in different environments? And so I was trying to understand how that ability for plants to be plastic could influence evolution. And for that, I did some very, very cool studies on Cape Cod kettle hole ponds, which are these really rare habitats where they're kind of these little kind of glacial carved out ponds where they tend to grow cranberries. Actually, they grow cranberries there in Cape Cod, but they also have some really interesting plants. So I spent some time doing field work in Cape Cod, which was lovely. So I did 3 years of that PhD, and I had a crisis of confidence, and I thought I wasn't good enough for academia. I couldn't pull it off. So I actually quit. I quit my PhD after three and a half years, and I was given a master's with I might settle right up, but I was given a master's, and I moved to Los Angeles.
wow.
Yeah, with my partner at the time. And at Los Angeles, I needed a job. So the first thing I did is I actually worked at a flower shop on Melrose Avenue, a very famous street. I worked at a flower shop. I became the manager actually. So yeah, so as you can see, there's always a plant theme going through. Um, then after that, I ended up getting a research assistant job at UCLA, at the University of California, Los Angeles. So I worked there on wetland mitigation. And the idea behind that, of course, is in America, and I think in most places, if developers or anyone wants to impact wetlands, they have to in some way mitigate for that. They have to create new wetlands or restore old wetlands or do something to, you can't just cut down, you can't just destroy wetlands without some kind of mitigation activity, or you're not supposed to. And so my job then was to see, are these mitigation activities actually working? The short answer is no, which is quite depressing. But it actually was a policy type project where we then could go to policy and say, look, you know, you're letting people destroy wetlands, and the work that they're doing to try to mitigate for that isn't working. These wetlands are not being restored or enhanced or created. So that was my work at UCLA. And then I got a job. This is when I kind of switched gears a little bit, and I worked in environmental consulting. And so I was still in LA when I started, but I eventually moved to Northern California to work at the same company. I was at Tetra Tech. And for that, I was also focusing on wetland mitigation and trying to make it more effective, because wetlands are so critical for so many things. And to think that we're just demolishing them at an astonishing and worrisome rate is really problematic. So I worked there for a while, and then, if I'm being honest, I didn't love working in environmental consulting. Like I said, I kind of envisioned doing lots and lots of very cool field work, but I really just did a lot of paperwork. I mean, I did some field work, but a lot of it was report writing. So I found that very boring. Um, so then I switched gears again. And at this point, I'm still in Northern California, and I worked at a biotechnology company, a plant-based biotechnology company. It was called Mendel Biotechnology, and it was in Hayward, California. And I worked there for quite a while, actually. Well, not maybe 4 years, something like that. And I became a plant physiologist. And so I was working with this absolutely brilliant supervisor named Graham Hymas, um, who actually did his PhD with Steve Long, back in the UK. And so he's a British guy who happened to be in California as my supervisor. And I just got into plant physiology, and we were using Lycors, gas exchange machines, and I really liked it. So basically, the biotech company would make, you know, transgenic plants, and then I would see what the effect was on their physiology. And I really liked doing that. But I got to the highest point in the company you could get to without a PhD. And at that point, I was turning 30, and I was having a bit of a, you know, what, third life crisis or something. And I thought I should probably figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Because at that point, I was doing mostly kind of, you know, research assistant, lab assistant type jobs, and that's totally fine. But I kind of wanted more, so I decided to apply for PhD programs, and I applied to several in the US, which were successful, actually. Um, but also, just on a whim, my British supervisor, this guy Graham Hymas, um, he said, "Oh, you know what? I've got a buddy over in Sheffield who's just starting a lab, and you know he seems to be doing pretty well. Would you ever consider moving to the UK for a PhD?" And at the time, I was like, well, maybe, you know, it's a big life change moving across an ocean. Um, but yeah, I went for it. I mean, at that point, like I said, I was around just turning 30, and the idea of doing a PhD in America, which tends to be what, 5 to 7 years, versus the UK, which is 3 to 4 years. Um, the faster approach seemed tempting considering my age. So I decided to up and move to Sheffield. So yeah, so at this point I've been on the East Coast of the US where I'm born, and then I was in LA and then San Francisco Bay Area. And then yeah, then I moved to Sheffield, England, and I did a PhD with Colin Osborne, and that was looking at photosynthetic diversity. And it was quite accidental how I stumbled upon it. My project was on how plants that use C3 or C4 photosynthesis, how they die differently. Because like if you think of like drought, and they have different you know, different mechanisms. I was just, yeah, I was trying to understand how plants with different photosynthetic backgrounds die differently. And in doing some background research, I came across this fascinating little grass called Allotropsis simulata. It's this little grass. And I was looking at papers from, the early 80s, I think, at that point. And it's so fascinating to look at old papers because you find so much information that it's just, unless you go back, it's lost. So I was going back and I was looking at these papers from like the late 70s, early 80s, and there were some really interesting tidbits where some people who had looked at this grass just happened to say, "Oh, there's some kind of interesting individuals here in, Central Eastern Africa. Someone should follow up on that." But of course, nobody did. So I decided to switch my PhD project and look at this interesting grass. And it turns out to be remarkable. It has populations that use C3 photosynthesis, and some populations use C4. But then there's a whole suite of populations that use an intermediate form, so C3, C4 intermediates, that uses physiology called C2 photosynthesis.
Ah.
And I was the first one to identify C3, C4 intermediates in the species. It is, of course, as far as I know, the most photosynthetically diverse species on the planet because it has basically in one species everything from C3 to C4. Yeah, so that was my PhD work, and then I ended up staying on and working more with Allotropsis simulata in a postdoc. I also worked, that was with Pascal Antoine Christin at Sheffield, working in an Allotropsis continually. And then I switched and stayed in Sheffield and worked with Andrew Fleming for a while. And that was fascinating work. It was looking at the connection between leaf structure and function. So how changes in, for example, mesophyll porosity affect physiology, or how changes in mesophyll porosity affects stomatal development. So I wasn't there for very long, but it was a really fascinating time, and I really enjoyed working with Andy. He's great. Right, and so then, if I'm being too long-winded, you can cut me off. Um, so then, I was still working with Pascal Antoine at Sheffield for a while, and I kind of just, if you haven't noticed yet, I get a bit antsy after a while. So I got antsy, and I decided to shift gears again. And so I moved back to America. I moved to Boston, and I worked at MIT. So I was at MIT, and I was also a fellow at the Arnold Arboretum
Oh.
in at Harvard. So I was there for a little while. My main project there was, instead of thinking of kind of evolution of a complex trait, with that complex trait being photosynthetic diversity, at MIT I was looking at kind of evolution of life history. So the annual to perennial transition, or vice versa, perennial to annual, because it goes back and forth quite a lot. So I was looking at basically perenniality at MIT. So I was there for a little while, and if I'm being honest, so I started that job kind of mid-January 2018, and mid-February a lectureship position opened at Lancaster, and I didn't really feel ready to apply for lectureships. It wasn't really on my radar, and somebody said, "Oh, you should apply for that," and I was like, "Ah, I'm not really ready." And so I kind of I applied, but half-heartedly, thinking, I'm too soon. I'm not ready. And pretty much right away, I got an email pretty quickly saying, can you come to the UK for an interview? And yeah, and then yeah, I heard that afternoon, about 40 minutes after my interview, that they wanted to offer me the job. So that was all very quick, considering I wasn't even planning on applying. And I stayed at MIT for until September, um, before I moved to Lancaster, back to the UK, to do this job. But also in between that time, between uh, finding out I had the lectureship and starting, I found out that I was awarded a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship. So I started on that, and that was to look at basically these C2 plants in more detail, which was great. And so I did that for a couple years, and then I transitioned onto I had maternity leave, and then I transitioned onto a Future Leaders Fellowship, which is kind of combining a lot of aspects from my past, and components of it are trying to characterize the C2 photosynthesis phenotype in detail, and parts of it are actually engineering C2 photosynthesis into crops.
So, I mean, you've had the most amazingly diverse and interesting career so far, as I said at the beginning, and it really is incredible. But I
Thank
mean,
you.
there's one thing that's been going through it, which is photosynthesis. I mean, everyone's heard of photosynthesis. It's the one thing plants do that animals don't do. But I think the fact that they do it in different ways is actually
Yeah.
quite a surprise, that there's multiple ways of doing photosynthesis, and
Yeah.
that's really the focus of your work, isn't it? Do you
Yep.
think you could say a little bit more about, well, why are there multiple ways of photosynthesis?
Absolutely. So we might think that all plants do photosynthesis one way, but if you think about it, there are plants in nearly every nook and cranny of this planet. And from deserts to rainforests to British moorland to evergreen forests. And in order for the plants to not only tolerate but to thrive in such diverse environments, they've had to evolve really kind of interesting and clever mechanisms to allow them to kind of take advantage of those environments and to fit into those environments better.
Okay. So, I mean, there's one other thing that also comes across from what you've been doing, which
Yep.
is that you've worked in America, you've worked in Britain, you've
Mhm.
worked in academia, you've worked in industry.
Yep.
Are are there any big, and I mean, I'm asking this because we're sort of aiming the times at young students, early career people who want to have careers with plants, and moving between countries is quite a big thing, and moving
Yeah.
between academia and industry is quite a thing as well.
Yep.
From your experience, were there things that surprised you about differences between the UK and America, or between academia and industry?
Yes, definitely. So there's a whole lot I can talk to along those lines. And again, do cut me off if I'm being too wordy. Um, so one of the main differences between academia and industry is money. Without sounding really shallow, I made a lot of money in biotechnology. I made much more money in biotechnology than in academia. And it took a long time, even after getting my PhD and working for years, to come anywhere close to what I was already making before I had a PhD when I was in biotechnology. The other
Okay.
thing is the work hours. So in biotechnology, I would pretty much work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. In academia, it's pretty much a nonstop, constant. It's constant work. It's never ending. I mean, if people are better with work with saying no and work-life balancing and compartmentalizing, perhaps it's not so bad. But that's one of the big differences. So when I was in industry, for example, you couldn't take your lab notebook home. It couldn't leave the building for IP reasons.
Yeah.
And so there was a very clear cut. I'm working now, and now I'm not working. 5 o'clock now I'm going home and I'm relaxing or I'm doing something fun. Whereas in academia, it's nonstop. So that's not healthy. Um, with that said, there's an aspect of freedom there. So in industry, um, we were partnering with some really big kind of biotechnology companies. And you pretty much have to do what they ask you to do. So if they want you to investigate a certain direction with a plant, even if you don't think it's a particularly interesting or promising one, you kind of just have to do what they want, because that's where the money's coming from. Whereas in academia, I think you can have a lot more freedom of what you look into, what you research, and I think you can have more creativity there. Um, so yeah, I think in the end, I decided the trade-off there between kind of freedom and creativity was worth the pay slashing. Yeah.
Do you think there's much difference between being working in America in academia and working in the UK?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I moved here. Um, America is just sadistic. I mean, I think here they work a lot in academia, but in America, I mean, people don't take holidays. They just work all the time. I mean, that's a blanket statement. Blanket statements are always a bit dangerous, but you know what I mean? Like when I was there, I feel like there was always a sense of like, you know, who's in first in the morning and who's out last at night. And, what do you mean you're taking a week off for holiday? It's like, I just feel like in America, people worked all the time. And in some ways, when you're young and you don't have other commitments, that's fun. Like, because if you love your job, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Um, but as you get older, at least me, and you have other commitments like a child and a family, you can't really be expected to do that as much. So that's one of the biggest differences. I think the UK is much more relaxed. People actually take holiday. Things are pretty much die down in August, which isn't really a thing in America. Um, so yeah, I think the work-life balance is much better here in the UK.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And the final question I have for you
Yeah.
is, what's your favorite plant?
That's actually very easy for me. It is definitely Allotropsis simulata, the grass. Um, so it is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the most photosynthetically diverse grass on the planet. It's fascinating. I love it. If I had to give a backup, though, I do love Asclepius, butterfly weed. Um, and I remember years and years ago when I was in my 20s thinking, I'd really like to name if I had a child after a plant, but Asclepius just isn't a good name for anyone, nor is butterfly weed. So I didn't end up going that route, but I do love those flowers. They're beautiful and they're fascinating.
Well, thank you very much for
Thank
talking
you.
with the Times, the newsletter of Botanical University Challenge.
You're very welcome. Yeah, it was really fun.
Right.